Alright, gang. So let's kick into Chapter 6. And in Chapter 6, we're going to install Hyper-V server role, create and use virtual machines, and manage and configure virtual machines. Now, when we're installing Hyper-V, we've got some virtualization terms we need to think of ahead of time, get an understanding of what they mean and how they're being used. A virtual machine, or a VM, that's the virtual environment that emulates a physical computer's hardware and BIOS. Guest OS is an OS installed in a VM the same way you install a OS on a physical computer. The host computer is the physical computer on which a VM runs. Virtualization software is software for creating and managing VMs and creating the virtual environment in which a guest OS is installed. We've got different types of virtualization software available, but the one we're dealing with today is Hyper-V. Now, Hypervisor creates and monitors the virtual hardware environment. There are two types of hypervisors. There's type 1 and type 2. Now, virtual disk, it consists of files on the host computer that represent a virtual machine's hard disk. They can be fixed or dynamic. A virtual network is a network configuration created by virtualization software and used by virtual machines for physical and virtual network communication. Now, a checkpoint is a partial copy of a VM made at a particular moment in time. Now, the best comparison to it is like a restore point for an OS. So here's our breakdown on installing Hyper-V. We've got a parent partition, child partition, child partition. Windows Server, Hypervisor, host computer hardware. We'll go through this in more depth. Now, there's system requirements to install and use Hyper-V. You need Windows Server 2016 Standard or Data Center Edition installed. Now, Standard, it could be Server Core, or we could run on Data Center. Now I'm starting to mess with my own self right now. I got confused in, what was it, 2 chapters back, where I kept calling it Data Center, and we weren't dealing with Data Center, we're dealing with desktop experience. Alright, we need a 4 gigahertz or faster 64-bit CPU with virtualization extensions. If it doesn't have or can't deal with virtualization extensions, it's not going to work. A CPU that supports DEP and SLAT. SLAT is, it's called EPT on Intel processors and NPT on AMDs. Virtualization support must be turned on in the BIOS. You need enough free space, disk space, to hold the OS that you're going to install as a VM. So if you've got an OS that's going to take up 3 or 4 gig, you're going to need 3 or 4 gig for each instance of the virtual machine that you create. And it adds up over time. Now, that's just the OS. That's not counting the virtual hard disks, any storage you may have aside from that. You need enough RAM equal to the minimum amount required for Windows Server 2016 plus the OS that you're going to install on the VM. So here we see Hyper-V, and we've got a number of virtual machines already created. Some are running, some are using CPU, some have a memory assigned. We can see what it is when they're running and how long they've been up. Down here's our checkpoints and information about the highlighted or the server with focus. Over here on the right, We can go in and manage. We can import virtual machines or create new virtual machine, virtual hard disks, a number of different things we can do. We'll get comfortable with this interface over time, and we're going to deal with it more and more in this chapter. Now, when you install the Hyper-V role from Server Manager, you're prompted to install the management tools, which you should do if you're going to be managing Hyper-V from the same server that's running Hyper-V. Now, you can install Hyper-V from PowerShell using the commandlet install Windows feature Hyper-V, and then include management tools. If you're going to be managing it remotely, you're going to need the RSet Hyper-V tools. You might want to consider managing the server remotely so that the management tasks are offloaded to another computer. Now, you can enable remote management through Server Manager by clicking Local Server, then clicking Remote Management, and then you could use the PowerShell commandlet instead, and it's configure SMR or SM remoting. To remotely manage Hyper-V using PowerShell remoting must be enabled, and that's what we had up above. And we've also got, if you want to disable it, you can use the commandlet enable PS remoting to kick it back on again if it, for whatever reason, becomes disabled. Now, on a PowerShell command prompt or PowerShell prompt, type enter PS session server Hyper-V, whatever the name of the remote server is. And if both computers are on the same domain, you won't have to enter credentials. If it's remote, you'll have to enter credentials and just get credential. If you have Hyper-V or VMs running on Windows Server 2012 or Server 2008, you need to upgrade the VM configuration version to take advantage of the new features of Windows Server 2016. The VM configuration version can be seen in Hyper-V Manager by selecting the VM and looking at the bottom pane. That's a summary tab. The configuration version for Windows Server 2016 Hyper-V is 8. If the version of the VM is less than that, you'll see the upgrade configuration option. To perform that, you can use PowerShell. There's commandlet update VM version, VM name, and VM name, that's the name of your virtual machine. Okay, here we go, and you can see the configuration, the version of Hyper-V that we're dealing with, when this install core was created, any notes you might have added. That's a Gen 1, not a Gen 2. So each one is set up differently. Now, if we're going to create virtual machines in Hyper-V, all tasks related to creating and managing virtual machines are listed in the Actions pane. That's on the right-hand side. I pointed that earlier. Hyper-V VMs consist of those files that are stored on the Hyper-V server. There's a configuration file and a virtual hard disk file. Now, you might also have checkpoint files or state files. Now, if you're going to create a VM, you start by clicking New Virtual Machine Wizard in Hyper-V Manager. Now, you give the new VM a descriptive name so you know the operating system, and if it's a server, what roles it may play. Choose a location for the VM. Choose whether it's going to be a Gen 1 or Gen 2 VM. Assign the amount of memory it requires. Configure networking. Create a virtual hard disk. Install an OS. Now, that is optional. You can install it after the fact if need be, but try to always do it in one shot. All right. Running VM does not require using Hyper-V Manager. You do need Hyper-V Manager to configure and manage a VM's properties or access it locally. Now, you can connect to a VM by using any of the following. You right-click the VM and click Connect. Double-click the VM. Select the VM and double-click its screenshot. select the VM and click Connect in the Action menu up above. And here is the Action menu. You can come up here and click it. So we put focus on it, and you'd come up here. You can double click on it, right click. There's a bunch of different ways to go about it. And here's that. We can come over here. Oh, there's actually another way. You can click here, Action and Connect. Or with focus, you can come down here. You see that you got focus on it and click Connect. There's actually more than they pointed out at. So the virtual machine connection console has the following toolbar icons: Control Alt Delete. Now that sends the equivalent keystroke of Control Alt Delete to the VM. Now what happens if you click Control Alt Delete on your host machine? Yeah, you're talking to the host machine, not the VM. And we have to have that differentiation. So there's a little icon for that. We've got a little shortcut as well, but we just use the icon. Now there's a start that starts the VM, turn off, turns off the VM, shut down, sends its signal to the OS to perform a standard OS shutdown. Now I say it all the time. If you start something, finish it. If you open something, close it when you're done. Same thing holds true to your virtual machines. We've got save, pause, and reset. It'll reset the VM. Checkpoint creates a checkpoint of the VM, and revert will allow us to revert back to any of the checkpoints that we've got. An enhanced session changes the session mode to enhanced. Now some of the tasks you can perform with the other menus. Now file, you can access the VM settings and exit the VM. Action, perform all the actions that are on the toolbar. Media, you can specify ISO file options. Clipboard, you can copy a screenshot of the VM to the clipboard. View, toggle the display of the toolbar. And help will get you help on various topics related to the virtual machine connection console. Now we've got advanced VM creation methods. VMs can be created using other methods besides the new virtual machine wizard. Now in that menu I pointed on to the right, we can import a VM that's been exported from a different host. We can copy the virtual disk, and we can convert a virtual or a physical machine to a virtual machine. Now exporting VMs can be exported and then imported to create one or more VMs. This feature allows you to back up a VM without shutting it down first. You can export a VM while it's running. After a VM is exported, it can be moved to archival storage as a backup, imported on another server running Hyper-V, or imported on the same server. Now we've got PowerShell commands. There's a command that is export VM, and then you have the VM name and the path where it's going. Okay. If we're going to import it, we've got the same kind of thing. We've got to register the virtual machine in place. We can restore a virtual machine, or we can copy it. If we're going to copy a virtual disk, the results of a copy is similar to export-import, but the procedure is a little different. You'll copy the virtual disk from an existing virtual machine to a new folder, or rename the copied file. Now create a VM with a new virtual machine wizard, but in the Connect Virtual Hard Disk window, select the Use an Existing Virtual Hard Disk option. The only real difference between this method and the import-export method is that this method, you got to create the virtual machine, and you can change the VM name and configuration in the wizard. Now, if you want to convert a physical machine to a virtual machine, Hyper-V has no built-in tools to create a VM from a physical computer. Other tools available to do this, you've got the SCVMM, or Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager, and there's also a free utility called Disk2 VHD that can be downloaded, runs on a physical server, and creates a virtual hard disk from the disk on the virtual server, or a physical server. Now what's the difference between Gen 1 and Gen 2? Now if you're creating a new VM, you have the option to create either a Gen 1 or a Gen 2 version. Now, Gen 2 VMs have enhanced capabilities and support for newer standards. In Gen 2, you can have UEFI firmware instead of just a traditional BIOS. You've got device support. You can do a network boot with IP version 6. You've got VHDX only support, GPT boot, disk expansion, reduced attack surface, and secure boot. Now, if you're converting a Gen 1 to a Gen 2, it's possible, but you can't always use a Gen 2 VM and Hyper-V versions for Windows Server 2012 R2. Gen 2 VMs only support Win8 or Win Server 2012 or later guest OSs. Now, when would I use Gen 1? Traditionally, if I'm going to do a Linux install, it's going to be a Gen 1. If I try to do an install, if I want to install Ubuntu, that's not going to go well if we're talking about Gen 2. So we just go with Gen 1 and it'll work fine, no worries. Okay. Managing virtual machines, we've got additional features you can use to manage and configure a virtual environment. You've got the VM hardware settings, integration services, checkpoints. We've got the automatic start and stop actions. We can use resource metering and enhanced session mode. Now, when it comes to virtual machine hardware settings, we've got BIOS and firmware settings. Now, the BIOS settings for a Gen 1 VM enable you to change the order in which the VM's BIOS searches for boot devices. You can click a device in the startup folder list box and click the up or down arrows to change the order. On a Gen 2 VM, the hardware category is firmware instead of BIOS, so UEFI. You can enable the secure boot feature and set the boot order. Here we are, BIOS, legacy network adapter. So we could change our order depending on how we've got this set up. Now this one's Gen 1. Got boot from a file. Okay, and when it comes to security, in the security settings of VM, you can enable or disable secure boot. Gen 2 VMs only though, not in a Gen 1. There's no security in a Gen 1. And you can enable encryption support as well. No encryption in Gen 1. So here we are. We've got a Gen 2. We've got secure boot, enable secure boot, template, trusted, right on down the line. We've got things that we can do here that we couldn't do if we had a Gen 1. Now, when it comes to dynamic memory, a Hyper-V feature allows an administrator to set startup minimum and maximum memory allocation values for each VM. Hyper-V adjusts the memory allocation for a VM up or down based on the actual memory needs. So we can reserve more space than we're actually using, but not actually block it off so nothing else can use it. Dynamic memory is not enabled by default, but we can turn it on. You enable it by choosing memory in the VM settings. Here we go, and right there we would click that enable dynamic memory. Set the min, set the max. So we've got hot add memory and remove memory. The addition of memory or removal of memory while the VM's running. This feature is supported on VMs running Windows 10 or Server 2016 guest OSs and some distributions of Linux, but it's not going to work on a 28 or 2012 server or Win8, those kinds of. The VM configuration version must be 8 or higher, and the VMs created in earlier versions of Hyper-V will not support this feature until you upgrade the configuration. So we've got smart paging. It's a Hyper-V feature that uses a file on the host computer for temporary memory storage. So it works just like a smart paging file in a host computer, but we'll call it smart paging for Hyper-V for our VMs. Now, if there's a sudden surge in memory requirement exceeds the physical memory amount of the memory available, it works with dynamic memory. There's no configurations needed when it comes to smart paging other than the location on the host computer to point where that paging file will be created or smart paging file will be created. So we've got virtual processor settings. Now the virtual processor is a representation of a physical processor or processor core residing on the host. You can adjust how many virtual processors are assigned to the VM up to the total number of physical processors or processor cores installed on the host computer. So you can't, if you've only got a dual processor, quad cores, a couple of dual quad cores, 2 processors, quad core, that's your max when it comes to your virtual machine. You can't say, oh, I've got 10 processors, and they're just, it doesn't work that way. All right, so we're limited to what exists on the host device. Okay, so you can determine how many processors you've got. Resource controls, limits, that's all for the processor. We've got integration services, storage controllers. We can go in, and when it comes to integrated services or integration services, here's everything that we can play with or adjust and turn things on and off. So when it comes to checkpoints, it's like a Wayback Machine, and it's one of the benefits, huge benefit to virtual machines in Hyper-V. So we've got 2 types of checkpoints, a standard checkpoint and a production checkpoint. And that's a production checkpoint is supported for production of virtual machines and uses backup technology in the guest OS to create the checkpoint. Production checkpoints, they don't save the running state of a virtual machine, but they can be created while the VM is running. So if we're going to manage checkpoints, you can create up to 50 checkpoints per VM. It shouldn't say you can create up to. You can create more than that, but that's the max you can have on the system at any given time. So you can remove checkpoints as you go. Say that you don't need them, you've replaced them. Checkpoints decrease the VM's disk performance. You've got to delete a checkpoint before expanding a disk. There's 2 ways to save a checkpoint. You can revert or apply, go back to a certain one, or apply a checkpoint at a certain time. That was taken at a certain time, I should say. So here we are. We've got some checkpoints. We've got checkpoint 2, checkpoint 3, checkpoint 4. Okay. We've got automatic start and stop actions. And we can come down here, automatic start and stop. It's on the pane and settings. So all we had to do was go over the right side, click on the VM. Over on the right side, the pane on the right, down at the bottom, you'll see that cog wheel. Click on that for settings. That'll open this up. Click down to the bottom, automatic start action. And you determine, do you even want any kind of automatic anything? Do you want the VM to turn on when the host turns on? Automatic stop. Do you want that to happen as well? Okay. So we've got resource metering. It's a Hyper-V feature that allows vendors of large-scale virtualization to measure customer use of the VM resources for billing purposes. Now, the following things can be measured: the average CPU use, incoming and outgoing network traffic per network adapter, min, max, and average physical use, physical memory use, max disk space allocated. And we can do this in PowerShell as well. There's the commandlet for it. Okay, we've got a commandlet here to create a resource pool. And if we need to configure the resource pool, we'll use this one. Now, through it, we've got enhanced session mode. And that's a feature that it improves the interaction and device redirection between the host computer and the VM connection console. Now, an enhanced session offers audio redirection, printer redirection, USB devices and smart cards, drives, some plug-and-play devices, display configuration, copy and paste of clipboard data and files and folders. So here we are, we're connected to server VM1, and we're adjusting the display configuration. And that's in an enhanced session mode. Okay, we can also go in enhanced session mode. We can change the policy, allow enhanced session mode, or say no, we're going to just turn it off. All right. So we've got non-uniform memory access, or NUMA, and it's a system memory architecture that it's used in multiprocessor systems that allows processors to more efficiently share memory. NUMA, it divides the memory and processors into groups called NUMA nodes. Now, memory in the same node as the processor is local memory, and memory in a different node is remote memory. And we can have NUMA spanning. If more memory is needed, then can be allocated from a single NUMA or a single NUMA node. Additional memory is allocated from another NUMA node. And here we go, it's NUMA spanning, and we can allow it or just turn it off. Now we've got delegation of VM management. It's users who are administrators of the Hyper-V host computer or domain administrators have full access to Hyper-V Manager, Hyper-V settings, and VMs. Okay. So if you're an administrator, you got full access. We've also got a Hyper-V Manager group that we can use. If you want a user or a group of users to have permissions in Hyper-V to perform only specific tasks, you can fine-tune permissions using Authorization Manager. And that's azman.msc, and that'll pop that up for us. And here's Authorization Manager. We can go in and set the different roles when it comes to Hyper-V services for groups. Here's the add the definition of the operations, what you can and can't do. Assign users and groups for it, for VM Manager. There's so much that we can do. So we've got Discrete Device Assignment, or DDA. It's a new feature in Windows Server 2016 Hyper-V. And it gives users the ability to give a VM exclusive access to hardware devices on the host computer. And with the DDA, the VM has direct access to the device, bypassing the hypervisor, which increases performance. So we've got commandlets to do the same kind of thing in PowerShell. And if we're going to manage VMs with PowerShell Direct, we can use the enter PS session and go in and use this commandlet. To exit, it's exit PS session. So Hyper-V virtualization environment sits between the hardware and the virtual machines. You can install Hyper-V in a Nano server deployment. The Nano server will require remote management. Hyper-V is installed as a server role in Windows Server 2016 64-bit versions of standard and data center editions. Let's print them all. Virtual machines from Hyper-V running in Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2008 must have an upgrade VM configuration. It needs to be up to 8.0. Hyper-V allows a virtual machine to run in the background until you connect to it in Hyper-V Manager. Virtual machines can be exported, imported, and create one or more virtual machines from an export. Virtual machines can that are created with the new virtual machine wizard have the option of creating a Gen 1 or Gen 2 VM. Many aspects of the VM physical environment can be configured: BIOS settings, memory allocation, and virtual processor settings. Checkpoints allow us to set a point in time where we can go back to a state from a previous point in time. Now, resource metering allows vendors providing large-scale virtualization to measure customer use of a VM resource for billing purposes. Non-uniform memory access, or NUMA, is a system memory architecture used in multi-processor systems that allow processors to efficiently share memory. Administrators of the Hyper-V host computer or domain administrators have full access to Hyper-V Manager. When it comes to DDA and PowerShell Direct, those are features in Windows Server 2016 Hyper-V. All right. So there we go. We're done with that chapter. Keep up the hard work and practice, practice, practice in those practice labs. Those live virtual labs are a great resource for us. When you have the time, if you've got Server Core up and running, or even if you've got the desktop experience, either one, fire up PowerShell and go in and get used to PowerShell commands. That's a huge resource for you.